Number 7. Mariana Bazes. A 19-year-old university student was kidnapped and murdered by a man who'd offered to help her replace her flat tire in September of 2019. At approximately 8 a.m. on the 24th of the month, physiotherapy student Mariana Bazes departed from a gym in Bariri, Brazil, with a friend. After her colleague had already left for work on her motorcycle, Bazes noticed that one of the tires on her car was deflated. A passerby, later identified as Rodrigo Pereira Alves, aged 37, approached the young woman and offered to assist her in fixing the flat. CCTV footage from the exterior of the gym captured the initial interaction. Alves then crossed over to the other side of the road and was soon followed by Bazes, who drove her car into a small lot outside the purview of the surveillance cameras. Bazes took a picture of the man as he worked on her vehicle and sent it to members of her family, including her boyfriend, Lieutenant Navy Officer Jefferson Viana. As the latter later told the police, Bazes indicated that she wasn't fearful of Alves at the time she'd sent the image. That message marked the final communication made by the young woman prior to her death. Security cameras recorded Bazes' car being driven from the scene roughly an hour later, but investigators believe that it was Alves operating the vehicle. One of Bazes' relatives attempted to contact her later that day, but was unable to reach her. The student was subsequently reported missing, and local authorities launched a manhunt for Alves. After gaining access to the picture Bazes had taken of him, officers descended on the suspect's residence in Itapolis and eventually located him hiding on the roof of a nearby house. The man confessed to the murder and revealed that he dumped the victim's body at a sugarcane farm 40 miles from the gym at which he'd first encountered her. Alves was reported as an individual with an extensive criminal record and had only been released from prison a month before he carried out Bazes' murder. Investigators later established that it was Alves himself who'd slashed the young woman's tire in the first place in order to entrap her. Number 6. William Husel. An Ohio doctor was charged with multiple counts of murder for prescribing fatal doses of pain medication to a number of his patients from 2015 to 2018. During his tenure as a critical care physician at Mount Carmel Health in Columbus, 43-year-old William Husel had allegedly ordered dangerously high doses of fentanyl for at least 25 of the individuals entrusted to his care. One of the cases, for which the doctor was criminally charged, involved a 63-year-old woman by the name of Beverly Schertzinger. Husel had reportedly given the elderly patient 500 micrograms of the synthetic opioid substance, which medical experts characterized as a lethal dose. In October of 2017, Schertzinger passed away not long after Husel had told the woman's family that her prognosis was bleak. A hospital staffer alerted local authorities to the doctor's suspicious behavior, and an investigation into his conduct led to his arrest on June the 5th of 2019. Detectives didn't disclose what they believed to have been the man's motive for distributing the deadly dosages to his patients. Prosecutors contended that there was no legitimate medical basis for Husel to have administered the drugs in such extreme quantities. The former doctor filed a motion to have his murder charges dismissed, but a Franklin County judge eventually denied his formal request in December of 2021. Number 5. Sydney Loof. In November of 2017, a young woman was murdered and dismembered after being lured on a date with a woman she'd met online. On November the 14th, 24-year-old hardware store clerk Sydney Loof of Neely, Nebraska, went on her first date with Bailey Boswell, also 24, whom she'd first encountered on Tinder. After their initial meetup, Loof was excited about seeing her again, as she'd reportedly told her colleague, Tara Gehring. Loof sent a message to her friends on Snapchat prior to her second date with Boswell the following night. She then failed to show up to work on November the 16th, prompting her loved ones to report her missing to local authorities. Loof's remains were eventually found by investigators on December the 4th, 3 weeks after her abrupt disappearance. Her dismembered body parts had been discarded in several trash bags. The investigation conducted by Saline County Police led them to arrest Boswell and her boyfriend, Aubrey Trail, aged 51. According to court records, Boswell had brought Loof to Trail's residence on the night of their second date, reportedly hoping to recruit the victim into the man's cult. At one point in the evening, Trail allegedly strangled Loof with an extension cord in an effort to keep her from alerting the authorities to his and Boswell's supposedly illicit lifestyle. During a court hearing in 2019, Trail attempted to slit his own throat while loudly declaring his girlfriend's innocence. He was ultimately sentenced to death in June of 2021, while Boswell was given a life sentence later that same year. Number 4. Anthony Sutherland. A woman was found guilty of fatally starving her landlord in order to inherit his multi-million-dollar estate. By the time of his death in 2014, 59-year-old Anthony Sutherland's health had already been in severe decline. The reclusive millionaire required a living caretaker, which prompted 62-year-old Linda Ricard, a former social worker and trusted friend of his, to move onto his farm in South Newington, Oxfordshire. Ricard subsequently orchestrated a plot to steal the wealthy man's fortune by forging his wills for him and his elderly mother that made herself a beneficiary of his estate. The woman successfully convinced Michael Dunkley, Denise Neal and Shanda Robinson to sign the fraudulent will as witnesses. Ricard then proceeded to deprive Sutherland of food and medical care in order to accelerate his imminent passing and hasten her coming into control of his wealth. She discouraged visitors in an effort to conceal the fact that the old man had become dangerously emaciated. Sutherland's death hadn't initially aroused suspicion, but an investigation was launched into the matter after Ricard was found to have taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from her former landlord's bank accounts. She eventually confessed to carrying out his murder and forging both wills in January of 2020. Dunkley, Neal, and Robinson were all found guilty of fraudulently signing said wills and were sentenced to prison terms varying in length from 24 to 32 months. Ricard was jailed for a minimum of 28 years, while her husband was sentenced to 10.5 years himself. Number 3. Gabriel Uli. A teenager from Nevada was abused and murdered by a close friend in March of 2020. The victim was identified as Spring Creek resident Gabriel Brittany Uli, a self-described cowgirl with an expressed passion for horses. The young woman had been reported missing on March the 8th. 3 days later, her body was found with slash wounds on her throat in a remote area of the desert near the city of Elko. On March the 19th, the Elko County Sheriff's Office announced in a press release that they'd arrested Bryce Dickey, aged 18, whom the victim had known from the rodeo circuit for many years. Dickey had publicly mourned Uli's loss on Facebook in the days following her disappearance, but he was ultimately charged with open murder in connection to her death. Investigators reportedly found bloody boots in the young man's closet and a contraceptive device near the scene of the crime that had traces of both Dickey's and Uli's DNA on it. Dickey had allegedly created a fake alibi during his initial interviews with the police, claiming to have witnessed the victim climb into a green pickup truck with a tall cowboy on the night she went missing. He faced a first-degree murder charge for killing a girl who'd reportedly considered him to be her big brother. Number 2. Bre Bedner. On February the 17th of 2014, a teenage boy was murdered in Essex, England, by a friend he'd met online. Before his violent demise, Bre Bedner from Caterham, Surrey, was a member of the Air Training Corps who'd spent a significant portion of his spare time playing video games online with his friends. Through his gaming sessions, Bedner had become acquainted with an unemployed computer engineer named Lewis Daines, aged 19. The latter soon joined the online gaming group to which Bedner also belonged. As their friendship progressed, Bedner's mother, Lauren Lefebvre, began to sense changes in the boy's personality and ideology, which she attributed to the negative influence Daines was having on him. In December of 2013, Lefebvre contacted Surrey law enforcement to express her concerns over the possibility that her son had become a victim of online grooming. She provided little in the way of actionable information for the police to follow through on. Thus, her impassioned warnings were largely ignored by the authorities. On the day of Bedner's murder, he'd hailed a taxi to take him to Daines' apartment, where the two were to meet in person for the first time. Later that day, Bedner's 12-year-old siblings, who were triplets, began receiving messages that their brother was dead. Danes had reportedly sent photos of Bedner's body to their gaming group, and the images were subsequently disseminated on social media. Emergency responders were called to Danes' flat, where Bedner was found with fatal stab wounds to his neck. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Danes, who was described by his neighbors as reclusive, was ultimately sentenced to life in prison for the murder. Crown prosecutor Jenny Hopkins called it one of the most cruel, violent and unusual cases with which she'd ever been involved.
Essex Police Emergency.
Hi there. Hello. I need police and a forensics team to my address, please.
What do you mean? What's happened?
My friend and I got into an altercation, and I'm the only one who came out alive.
Are you telling me you've killed somebody?
Yes, I am.
Right, and who am I speaking to?
My name is Lewis Danes. I'm 18 years old, and I live...
You're telling me he is definitely dead?
Yes, I'm telling you he's definitely dead.
If you're only just getting warmed up, then stick around after number 1 to also watch our previous compilation about when completely overacting goes wrong. Number 1. Keely Bunker. A 20-year-old woman from Tamworth, England, was assaulted and murdered by her childhood friend on the night of September the 18th of 2019. Keely Bunker was accompanied by a close female friend as she attended a performance by British rapper H at the O2 Arena in Birmingham. The pair were reportedly celebrating Bunker's recent birthday. After the concert had ended, the two women met up with Wesley Street, also 20, whom Bunker had known since they were children. The group went to a nightclub where Street became extremely intoxicated after allegedly consuming 3 drinks for every one the girls had had. They later got a taxi back to Tamworth, at which point Bunker's female friend offered to let her stay the night at her apartment. The young woman refused, claiming that she was tired and wanted to sleep in her own bed. Bunker also said that Street would walk home with her and ensure she got there safely. The following day, Bunker's uncle found her lying face down in a brook in Wigginton Park. Her lifeless body had been hidden beneath a pile of branches. A post-mortem examination of Bunker's corpse was performed, during which it was determined that she'd been strangled to death. Street's DNA was found on her body, and he was subsequently taken into custody and charged with murdering his trusted friend. He claimed to have accidentally killed the young woman as they supposedly engaged in consensual relations, but he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. Number 8. Grzegorz Kich. 22-year-old Grzegorz Kich and Karolina Ciwilik, aged 20, had been dating for a few years before the latter ended the relationship in April of 2017 as she'd become wary of Kosich's excessive drinking and the aggressive behavior that ensued from it. The former couple, both of Polish descent and living in London, continued seeing each other as friends. Nevertheless, Kosich pleaded with his ex, an architecture student at the University of Westminster and part-time waitress at the Polish embassy, to take him back. He reportedly followed her around London and sent her repeated messages on social media. After a few weeks, Ciwilik started dating a mutual friend. Kosich's jealousy and anger spiraled out of control when he was rejected, as he asked his ex to choose between him and her new love interest. On May the 4th, he went to see her at his cousin's 2-bedroom flat in Mile End, East London. It was there that, armed with a kitchen knife, Kosich unleashed a frenzied attack. He slashed and stabbed the young woman at least 20 times in the neck, head and body. Dawid Chizawiski and Monica Fijak, aged 24 and 42 respectively, were also at the address and heard the victim screaming from the bathroom. They found Kosich standing over her and were also stabbed while attempting to wrestle the knife away from him. They both recovered after receiving treatment at a local hospital, but Ciwilik, who'd never even had a chance to defend herself in the savage attack, died from her injuries. Kosich, who maintained that he'd loved the victim and had only gone to the apartment with the intention of talking to her, was jailed for life, with a minimum of 20 years served. Number 7. Jonathan McSharry. In March of 2019, Irish woman Jessica Bowes was awarded over $165,000 after suing her ex-boyfriend over a gruesome attack that had occurred as she was returning to her home from a night out in Clondalkin, Dublin. In 2014, she'd sought a protective order against her ex-soldier Jonathan McSharry after a prolonged psychologically and physically abusive relationship. On December the 20th of 2015, as Bowes returned home, McSharry, then in his early 30s, was waiting to ambush her at the address. As shown by CCTV footage, he dragged the mother of his 2 children from the taxi before headbutting and punching her repeatedly. He then kicked her up to 20 times as she sought refuge under a parked car. The attack lasted close to 2 minutes, over the course of which Bowes lost consciousness twice, before eventually crawling to safety into a neighbor's house. McSharry had broken nearly every bone in her face, and surgeons subsequently had to insert a permanent metal plate through Bowes' mouth in order to realign her facial bones. She underwent a psychological evaluation that concluded her mental health had been severely affected by her ex's onslaught. She had symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic anxiety, nightmares, and had become fearful of her own safety and that of her children. Prior to being ordered to pay damages, McSharry had served 22 months of a 3.5-year prison sentence for the assault. Number 6. Robert Jenny. Robert Jenny and Louise Reed from Middlesbrough, England, had met when they were in their teens and began dating years later in the spring of 2018 after a chance encounter at a soccer match. The relationship had been promising in the beginning, but within 3 months, 27-year-old Reed reported that Jenny had become controlling and aggressive. On the night of July the 21st, they got into an argument at his parents' house that ended in 30-year-old Jenny punching Reed and dragging her down 3 flights of stairs. In spite of the attack, the woman decided to give him a second chance and help Jenny deal with his demons by encouraging him to get professional treatment for his anger and talk openly about his emotions. Over 2 weeks later, on August the 8th, during another escalating argument, Jenny attacked the mother of one even more viciously than before. He threw Reed around the house before punching and headbutting her into unconsciousness. When the woman came to, she was forced to flee the home through the kitchen window. Ultimately, at Teesside Magistrates Court, Jenny was handed a 12-month community order for the assault and instructed to pay the victim the equivalent of $100 in compensation. Reed later shared a graphic photo on Facebook of the attack's aftermath, showing her with blood streaming down her face in an effort to encourage other victims of domestic violence to speak out. She wrote about the unforgettable look of hate and anger on her ex's face during the beatdown and cautioned other women towards recognizing the early signs of an abusive relationship, such as obsessive and controlling behavior. Reed also criticized the light sentence that Jenny had received, calling it disgusting, highlighting that she'd been left emotionally traumatized by an attack that could have ended her life, while Jenny was free and thus able to potentially victimize other women. Number 5. Zachary Gross. In March of 2017, Kentucky man Zachary Gross, aged 31, was sentenced to 21 years in prison at Boone County Circuit Court for a horrific attack he'd perpetrated against his ex-girlfriend, Marilyn Stanley. The incident had occurred in September of 2015 when, as argued by prosecutors, Gross had become enraged that another man had posted a photo of Stanley and her son on Facebook. During a meal, he started striking her in the face before using a knife to remove most of her scalp. He then ordered his pit bull, named Capone, to attack the woman. Capone tore Stanley's ear off, with Gross then praising the dog for the gruesome mauling. Prosecutors also stated that after the victim had been scalped and mutilated, Gross forced her up in front of a mirror so that she would see the damage he'd inflicted upon her. He reportedly told the woman, "You're bald now. Who's going to want you now?" He subsequently placed her severed scalp in a plastic bag and dropped her off in her mother's neighborhood, after which the authorities were alerted. The mother of one was rushed to a hospital and throughout her ordeal had 6 surgeries and was left with permanent nerve damage. She couldn't remember the scalping due to a combination of shock and blood loss. During his sentencing, Gross told a judge, "I don't need a lecture," after claiming that he didn't feel responsible and maintaining his innocence. Number 4. Daniel Murtaugh. Irishman Daniel Mytto savagely beat his ex-girlfriend, 30-year-old beautician Nadine Lott, at the latter's home in St Mary's Court, Arklow, on December the 14th of 2019. He then fled the scene in his Volvo and later in the morning crashed into a ditch, sustaining minor injuries. He told a motorist who'd stopped to help him, "I killed my wife because she was with my friend." Lott's mother found her struggling to breathe while lying on her back in the kitchen. She'd been beaten so badly that her face was left unrecognizable. A neighbor and eyewitness reported to have heard Mytto, then in his early 30s, growling as he assaulted his ex, comparing the attack to that of a wild animal. It later emerged that Mytto, who'd been boxing for years, had held the charger of a tire pump in his hand for solidity and wrapped the tire around his knuckles before delivering relentless blows to his ex-girlfriend's face and body. A paramedic recalled kneeling on broken glass to revive the woman and claimed that he'd forever be haunted by the scene, which he described as one of the most horrendous he'd ever walked into. Lott was rushed to a Dublin hospital where she passed away 3 days after the attack, with the cause of death determined to have been hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy due to traumatic head, neck and chest injuries. Mytto was charged with murder, but his defense pushed for a downgrade to manslaughter, claiming that he wasn't responsible for his actions because he'd been under the influence of drugs and alcohol. The prosecution put forward the notion that the sheer brutality of the beatdown, as well as the lack of an effort from Mytto to find help for the victim, proved murderous intent. The latter argument prevailed. A jury rejected Mytto's defense, and he was given a mandatory term of life imprisonment. Number 3. Douglas Bell. In July of 2019, while driving through South Shields in South Tyneside, England, 32-year-old Douglas Bell spotted his ex-girlfriend, Gemma Humphrey, pushing their young daughter in a pram down the street. 30-year-old Humphrey had broken up with Bell in December of 2017 after an abusive relationship lasting 3 years. The latter refused to accept her decision, which led to Humphrey taking out a restraining order against him. He was in direct violation of it in July of 2019 when he pulled up alongside her. The woman was so fearful of Bell that she ran away but then returned, realizing she'd left their daughter behind. When Humphrey came back, Bell punched her twice in the head, dropping her to the pavement, which caused her to bump her head and black out. She regained consciousness on his bathroom floor with blood on her face and in a state of panic. Looking back on the moments that followed, Humphrey remembered how unfazed Bell had been about what he'd done. He admitted to knocking her out and told the woman to clean her face of blood so that their daughter wouldn't see. Humphrey told her crazed ex that he'd broken her jaw, which he denied doing, before dropping her off and telling her to text him later. She called her mother, who alerted the police and then took her to the hospital. A photo of Humphrey taken right after the attack showed her with a severely swollen jaw and a black eye. She underwent a surgery of over 4 hours in which metal screws and plates were inserted in her face to mend her broken jaw, and was later told she'd never get the feeling back in her face. Bell was subsequently jailed for 2 years, a sentence that Humphrey deemed to have been far too lenient. Number 2. Katy Leon. In January of 2015, Romanian man Daniel Rotariu, then in his late 20s, met Katy Leon and they began a relationship, eventually moving in together to a house in Leicester, England. Leon had told Rotariu that she was 36 years old, when in reality she was in her early 50s. The lie would foreshadow a troubled relationship marred by arguments in which the two eventually began to drift apart. In July of 2016, Rotariu was sleeping alone in the bed after yet another row with Leon. He woke up in agony and initially believed that the woman had poured boiling water over him. Rotariu recounted that the pain was so intense that he believed himself to still be dreaming. He rose from the bed and then could taste in his mouth that it wasn't water with which Leon had doused him. She'd poured on him half a liter of highly concentrated sulfuric acid that had begun burning away the flesh on his body and face, rendering him unable to see. A court would later hear that Leon had previously tested the acid on sausage meat to make sure it would dissolve human flesh. She was ultimately found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 17 years served. In the attack's immediate aftermath, Rotario was rushed to Nottingham City Hospital, where he spent 5 weeks in a coma. The attack had blinded him while also inflicting such severe disfiguration that his own family couldn't recognize him. In the early days of his recovery, Rotario was so depressed that he'd considered taking his own life. He then found strength and support in his caregiver, Anna Katanga, who helped him through rehab at a support center. Before long, they developed feelings for each other, and Katanga quit her job so that they could start dating. A media report from July of 2019, 3 years after Rotario had been horrifically attacked by his crazed ex, detailed how his relationship with Katanga had blossomed. The pair had gotten married in the man's hometown of Timisoara and had a 10-month-old son, David. Rotario told a media outlet, "I've had the happy ending I never thought was possible." Number 1. Bradley Thomas Was. On February the 13th of 2018, the authorities in California found the lifeless body of 31-year-old Casey McKinney at her Redlands apartment. Further investigation revealed that the woman had been at home with her boyfriend and son when her ex, Bradley Thomas Was, burst in and opened fire on them. After shooting McKinney in the face, Was turned his attention on the child, identified as his own son, and the new boyfriend, who wasn't named by the authorities. The latter managed to escape the apartment by grabbing the woman's son and jumping from a second-floor balcony. He was hurt in the fall, but eventually recovered, while the child was unharmed and later placed in the custody of protective services. McKinney succumbed to her injuries at the scene, and the police subsequently launched efforts to track down Was. More than a week since the shooting, his body was found at the Indian Hills Golf Club in Mira Loma. While his motive for McKinney's murder remained unclear, the de facto speculation was that he'd been angry at the woman for getting in a new relationship. Number 7. George Hugley. In May of 2010, Yeardley Love and her ex-boyfriend, George Hugley, were close to graduating from the University of Virginia. Both were star lacrosse athletes and had engaged in an on-again, off-again romance since their freshman years. Their relationship was turbulent at times, mainly due to Hugley's heavy drinking and violent outbursts while under the influence. At one point, he'd attempted to strangle Love and then sent her an email claiming he wished he'd killed her. His alcohol abuse gradually got worse when he became a senior, and as graduation was approaching. It was also during that year that he and Love, both 22 at the time, had broken up. Hugley's teammates were on the verge of preparing an intervention for him, but decided to wait until after the upcoming lacrosse tournaments. As Hugley's drinking increased, so did his aggressiveness. He reportedly beat up a teammate while he was sleeping for leaving a party with Love. On May the 3rd of 2010, Hugley went to his ex-girlfriend's off-campus apartment. It was there that an argument erupted, resulting in the drunk and enraged athlete beating Love repeatedly and inflicting fatal injuries by smashing her head against a wall. Love's roommates found her lying in a pool of her own blood with extensive wounds to her neck, face, and jaw. Hugley was arrested following the attack and ultimately sentenced to 23 years in prison for second-degree murder. Number 6. Benjamin Green. On the night that she tried breaking up with him on August the 27th of 2021, a young marketing executive was stabbed to death by her boyfriend. The incident took place in Kettering, Northamptonshire, England. 22-year-old Maddie Durden Hollenby had been arguing with boyfriend Benjamin Green, 19 years her senior, about her decision of going on holiday without him. Her mother later told a media outlet that she'd headed to his home with the intention of putting an end to their relationship. Friends then wondered why she hadn't joined a group call and became further concerned when it emerged that Durden Hollenby had missed a work meeting. One of the young woman's friends went to her home and contacted the police when there was no answer. As the authorities checked Green's residence, they found both their bloody bodies lying alongside each other on the floor. Investigators determined that Green had fatally stabbed Durden Hollenby before turning the blade on himself. The couple had been dating for about a year, and the horrific incident shocked all who knew them, as there'd been no reports of domestic abuse or signs to indicate that Green was unstable. Number 5. Ifha Mortaza. In May of 2007, one of the most brutal slayings in Orange County history occurred in the Anaheim Hills community. 18-year-old Shaona Danek had broken up with boyfriend Ifha Mortaza, then in his early 20s, because her family didn't approve of him. It was reported that cultural and religious differences had also played a role, since Mortaza was Muslim. while Danak hailed from a Hindu background. The latter's family threatened to stop paying her college tuition if she didn't separate from Mortaza, which she consequently did. A few months later, in an ill-conceived attempt at getting back together with her, Mortaza planned to kill Danak's family, whom he perceived as an obstacle. Along with 2 accomplices to whom he'd promised payment, he went to the Danak family's mansion in Anaheim Hills and abducted 3 of them. Mortaza stabbed his ex-girlfriend's father, 56-year-old Jay Prakash, at least 27 times and struck him in the head with such force that he fractured his skull. He then slit the throat of Danak's sister, Karishma, aged 20. She was still alive as Mortaza doused both her and Jay Prakash in gasoline and then set them ablaze. Their badly burnt bodies were recovered from near a bike trail in Irvine, where first responders had been called to reports of a bushfire. Danak's mother, Leela, was found unconscious on a neighbor's lawn close to her burning mansion back in Anaheim Hills. She'd been stabbed in the stomach and her throat had been cut open. Leela remarkably survived her injuries and awoke from a coma 3 weeks after the attack to find that her husband and daughter had been killed and that her home had been ravaged by fire. Mortaza was subsequently arrested at a Phoenix airport while trying to return to his native Bangladesh. In 2011, in a jailhouse ceremony, he married 20-year-old suspected murderer Marissa Starr Bilotti, with whom he'd been corresponding for several months. Their union would eventually be shaken up by the course of justice, as Mortaza was sentenced to death for murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy in 2013. Number 4. William Riley Gore. In November of 2016, a football player at Maryville College in Tennessee shot and killed his cheerleader ex-girlfriend, whom he'd reportedly been stalking following their breakup. William Riley Gore was distraught after Emma Walker had ended their relationship in what he deemed to have been a cruel manner, as she'd reportedly told him, "You need a life." Walker was subsequently shot through the wall of her dorm room as she slept and suffered fatal injuries. Gore would tell investigators that he'd last spoken to her around midnight, at which point she'd asked him to stop calling her. He claimed to have spent hours in the dorm's parking lot crying and looking at pictures on his phone, before going to bed at around 4:45. Cell phone data would place him near Walker's home at about 3:35 a.m., around the same time when the gunshots were reported. Friends of his testified that in the aftermath of the shooting, he'd asked if they knew how to remove fingerprints from a gun and where he could dispose of it. He claimed to have stolen the weapon from his grandfather and that he feared becoming a suspect in light of his connection to the victim. His friends contacted the police. Gore was watched by the authorities and intercepted by them as he headed to throw the gun into the Tennessee River. He'd eventually admit to shooting Walker, but claimed it only meant to scare her, hoping that she'd turn to him as a rescuer and their relationship could start anew. He was sentenced to life with parole eligibility after 51 years for first-degree murder, stalking, and tampering with evidence. Number 3. Ivon Woo. In October of 2021, NYPD officer Ivon Woo was charged with murder and attempted murder after shooting her former girlfriend and the woman's new partner. 31-year-old Woo had dated Jenny Lee, 8 years her junior, for about 2 years before they'd broken up. About a month prior to the incident, Woo, described as jealous and possessive in their relationship, was unable to move past the breakup, according to friends familiar with the situation. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, Lee and her new girlfriend, 24-year-old Jamie Liang, had been involved in an altercation with Woo. Lee didn't report it to the NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau, believing she'd be able to handle the conflict on her own. In October, Woo lay in wait and ambushed the couple as they returned to their Brooklyn apartment. She opened fire, striking both Lee and Liang multiple times. The former survived and recovered in a hospital, but Liang succumbed to her injuries. Woo told the police that she'd wanted to take her own life after the shooting, but both neighbors and arresting officers reported she seemed calm and collected at the scene. Based on the latest updates on the case, she was taken to a hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. Number 2. Ahmed Shabaz. On November the 14th of 2019, Swedish teenager Wilma Anderson from the town of Uddevalla was reported missing. The local authorities, with support from the Swedish Armed Forces, searched for her in an operation that also involved divers and a mini-submarine. Within a week, her ex-boyfriend, 22-year-old Ahmad Shabaz, became the main suspect in her disappearance, and he'd been confirmed as the last person to have seen Anderson alive. On November the 28th, the authorities searched his home and found Anderson's severed head stashed away in a trolley in his bedroom. The head was wrapped in tin foil and the authorities suspected Shabaz had kept it as a sickening memento. In spite of overwhelming evidence, he maintained his innocence. The authorities believe that Anderson had gone to the home to retrieve some of her belongings after the recent breakup, at which point she was murdered and dismembered by her enraged ex. Following a psychological evaluation, experts would determine that Shabaz didn't suffer from a serious or invalidating mental illness, but that he exhibited what was described as narcissistic personality traits as well as a remarkable lack of empathy. He was sentenced to life in prison but never admitted his guilt, while the rest of Anderson's body was never found. Number 1. Thomas Montgomery. In May of 2005, two people using the handles Marine Sniper and Tall Hot Blonde struck up a relationship in an online chat room. As they began conversing, Tall Hot Blonde revealed she was a softball-playing high school senior from West Virginia named Jessie. Marine Sniper was actually Thomas Montgomery, aged 46, a married father of 2 from Buffalo, New York. But he decided to pose as a young, Iraq-bound Marine named Tommy in his talks with Jessie. The pair exchanged photos, seemingly confirming their identities, with factory worker Montgomery using those from his army boot camp when he was younger. They eventually confessed their love to each other and had virtual relations, but also exchanged love letters and mementos, with Jessie sending Montgomery a pair of red panties. Speaking about the relationship, Montgomery later told a media outlet, "It became more real to me than real life," and compared it to a drug. Notes written to himself revealed that he'd begun to lose touch with reality, as he claimed his old self no longer existed and that he'd become his avatar. Problems arose after Montgomery's wife found out about his cyber life and sent Jessie a letter with a photo of him, revealing who he truly was. Jessie promptly broke off the relationship and began talking to one of Montgomery's work colleagues, a 22-year-old machinist named Brian Barrett, who used the screen name Beefcake. Montgomery watched their love blossom in the same chat room, and his subsequent messages became violent. Montgomery told Jessie that Brian will pay in blood and became enraged upon learning that they were planning to meet in real life. On September the 15th of 2006, maddened by jealousy, Montgomery used a military rifle and executed Barrett in the parking lot of the factory where they both worked. The police learned about the love triangle from co-workers and believed that Montgomery would target Jessie next. Upon arriving at her home address, they were greeted by a middle-aged woman named Mary Schuyler. A shocking revelation followed as she admitted to being Tall Hot Blonde. She had been talking to both Barrett and Montgomery while using the pictures of her daughter, the real-life Jessie, without her knowledge. Schuyler wasn't charged with anything, but her husband divorced her and Jessie cut ties. Montgomery, concretely linked to the killing of Barrett by DNA from a peach pit found at the scene, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Number 8. Chloe Palmer. On November the 25th of 2017, a girls' night out in the town of Watford, England, descended into complete chaos when an argument broke out on the car ride home. The designated driver for the evening was Cristala Amphlett, aged 19. While traveling down the M1 motorway that connects London and Leeds, Amphlett got into a passionate exchange with one of her backseat passengers, a young woman named Maisie O'Flynn. Their dispute was about Amphlett asking for petrol money from the 3 girls she was driving home. At one point in the argument, Amphlett pulled the car over to the shoulder and switched off the ignition in order to focus her full attention on O'Flynn. According to the vehicle's GPS, the car was stationary for a total of 17 minutes as the discussion continued. Amphlett had the headlights turned off and neglected to activate the car's hazard signal while it sat motionless on the side of the road. Nearby roadway lights were not illuminated either, so the vehicle was nearly invisible to oncoming traffic. Others had to swerve out of the way of the parked vehicle due to the fact that Amphlett had the driver's door open and her legs sticking out towards the road as she addressed O'Flynn in the seat behind her. Suddenly, another vehicle crashed into the back of Ampflett's Renault Twingo. The brutal collision caused multiple severe injuries not only to Amphlett and O'Flynn, but also to Chloe Palmer, the 19-year-old girl sitting next to O'Flynn in the back seat. Palmer sustained major brain damage and ultimately passed away in the hospital roughly a week later. Although the case was brought to court to determine whether Amphlett should be held responsible for her friend's death, she was eventually acquitted in December of 2020. Following the ruling, Amphlett posted a video to Snapchat in which she could be seen celebrating with a bottle of champagne. Number 7. Jose Meza. An argument between siblings in Keeland, Mississippi, ultimately led to a deadly shooting on the night of April the 26th of 2021. Jose Mesa was engaged in a fierce disagreement with his sister, 24-year-old Scott County resident Erica Mesa. The triggering factor in their argument was a key. As the dispute reached its explosive conclusion, Erica took out a firearm and released a round into her brother's chest. Jose was rushed to Scott Regional Hospital and immediately tended to by medical professionals in the emergency room. Upon realizing the injured man had suffered a gunshot wound, doctors at the hospital contacted the Scott County Sheriff's Office. In spite of the hospital's best efforts, the victim was pronounced dead. Erica Mesa was soon brought into police custody and charged with the first-degree murder of her own brother. She was held in county jail and denied bail by a judge while she awaited her trial. Number 6. Keeland Ahmad Pickins. When the US's #1 ranked college football team suffered an upset loss on October the 9th of 2021, events were set in motion that culminated in the death of 27-year-old Keeland Ahmad Pickins. The Alabama Crimson Tide were defeated by the Texas A&M Aggies, an outcome deemed unexpected by most college football fans. While attending a watch party in Bessemer, Alabama, Pickins soon became embroiled in an intense argument about which team was better with Emmanuel Tolbert III, aged 20. The homeowner asked the two men to leave as tensions between them continued to escalate. Once outside, Tolbert resorted to violence to settle the dispute. Shots were fired, Pickins was struck, and Tolbert fled the scene. People rushed outside and found the victim with multiple gunshot wounds to his torso. He was transported to UAB hospital but later passed away from his injuries. Tolbert was on the run for only a couple of days before he turned himself into Bessemer police. In addition to Pickins' murder, Tolbert also faced charges from an incident in November of 2020 in which he and 3 others had robbed a man at gunpoint. Number 5. Alexandro Diaz Jr. 27-year-old Alexandro Diaz Jr. of Fresno County, California, met a violent end after getting into a contentious argument on his lunch break. Diaz was a forklift driver at Braith Produce's plant in Reedley, and on April the 13th of 2021, made his way down to Oaks Mini Mart with a few of his co-workers. While browsing the convenience store, Diaz got into a verbal altercation with another patron named David Cedino, aged 26. Their dispute was reportedly gang-related, as both individuals were later discovered to have ties to gangs in the area. Employees at the mini-mart recounted to police that the two men yelled at each other for a short while before Cedino threw up his hands in disgust and left the store. Diaz and his co-workers subsequently made their way back to work. Unbeknownst to them, however, Cedino had started following the men back to the Braith Produce packing plant. As Diaz got out of his car and walked across the parking lot, Cedino approached him in his own vehicle and shot him. The victim was taken to Adventist Health, where he was pronounced dead. A warrant was issued for Cedino's arrest on May the 28th after Reedley police identified him on surveillance tapes taken from the mini-mart and other surrounding businesses. The very next day, he was found and arrested by the Missouri State Highway Patrol. He was charged with murder and felon in possession of a firearm. Number 4. Calvin Durham II. A heated argument over a Facebook post ultimately led to the fatal shooting of 37-year-old Calvin Durham II in a barbershop in Norfolk, Virginia. Durham's dispute with Fareed Nelson Luckett began around 12:30 p.m. on June the 4th of 2021. The pair got into an altercation in the parking lot outside of the Capital Cuts barbershop, eventually needing to be separated by a few of the shop's employees. Nelson Luckett was taken inside while Durham was left in the lot. That wasn't the end of the argument, however, as not long after their initial separation, Durham stormed back into the shop and confronted Nelson Luckett over one of his Facebook posts. The fight turned physical once again, and Nelson Luckett got a hold of Durham's firearm in the midst of the struggle. Durham was shot with his own weapon and Nelson Luckett was wounded as well, but his injuries were not life-threatening. Durham, the son of a local pastor, would later pass away while receiving treatment at Centara Norfolk General Hospital, while Nelson Luckett was charged with second-degree murder. Number 3. Tatiana and Adar. In May of 2021, a Russian man simply identified as Adar was suffocated under the weight of his 225-pound wife, named Tatiana. The couple had reportedly gotten into a drunken argument before the fatal incident occurred. Tatiana became so enraged at her husband that she pinned him beneath her backside and, quite literally, sat on him to death. She insisted to Russian police that she had no intention of killing him, but only sought to calm him down by physically restraining him. Their daughter, upset at the sight of her mother crushing the life out of her father, ran to the neighbors for help. But they deemed the situation a domestic dispute and left the couple to settle it on their own. Adar passed away while stuck between his wife and their mattress. His official cause of death was asphyxia from blocking the respiratory system. After her husband stopped showing signs of life, a panicked Tatiana tried to shake him awake, to no avail. She was initially charged with murder, but that allegation was dropped in favor of criminal negligence, of which she was eventually convicted. She was forced to serve 18 months of corrective labor in order to pay £2,000 in moral damages. Number 2. Alexandra R. Bloodgood. A 29-year-old resident of Portland, Oregon, named Alexandra R. Bloodgood was shot dead by her own brother-in-law following a heated argument that turned violent. The initial dispute took place between the victim's husband, Jordan Arb, and his 25-year-old brother Shane Finnell on May the 16th of 2021. Though the specifics of their disagreement were not revealed in the immediate aftermath, the brothers' fight was reportedly centered on the seemingly trivial subject of laundry. As the argument escalated, Arb threw a potted plant at his brother. Finnell then approached a seated Arb Bloodgood who was facing away from the two men. He pulled out a chrome-plated revolver and shot his sister-in-law in the back of the head, execution style. After hearing the gunshot go off, a next-door neighbor went downstairs to determine the source of the commotion and noticed Finnell on the porch across the street. He was flailing his arms and looked extremely distraught. The neighbor walked over to check on him, at which point Finnell confessed to the killing and asked the man to call the police. When the authorities arrived, Finnell repeated his chilling admission, saying, "I did a horrible thing," as Portland officers took him into custody. He was charged with second-degree murder and unlawful use of a weapon. Number 1. James and Lisa Goy. Tensions between neighboring residents of Plains Township, Pennsylvania reached a boiling point on the morning of February the 1st of 2021. According to others in the neighborhood, 47-year-old Jeffrey Spade had a long-standing feud with a couple that lived across the street from him. James and Lisa Goy, aged 50 and 48 respectively, reportedly had a habit of shoveling snow from their driveway and dumping it on Spade's property. Spade had requested they refrain from putting snow in his yard on multiple occasions before the situation ultimately turned fatal. Plains Township had just been blanketed with 2 feet of snow, and the Goys moved the powder from their own parking spots over to Spade's yard across the street. The couple soon got into a shouting match with Spade as both parties hurled various expletive-laden insults at one another. The altercation became physical when James Goy threw a snow shoveling tool at his neighbor and charged towards him with a raised fist. Spade retreated to his house before emerging with a firearm in hand. Rather than flee, the Goys simply continued their verbal tirade from the middle of the street, reportedly daring their neighbor to shoot them. At that point, Spade opened fire on the couple, striking them both multiple times and inflicting deadly injuries. Police were called to the scene after reports of shots fired, but when they entered Spade's home, they found him dead from an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. Number 7. Belinda Hernandez. A veteran of the Houston police force was jailed after he allegedly murdered his wife of 30 years for flirting with another man. The victim, identified as school librarian Belinda Hernandez, aged 52, was found dead in her kitchen on March the 23rd of 2019 by her adult daughter. Hernandez had reportedly succumbed to multiple gunshot wounds inflicted by her husband, Hilario, who'd been a Houston police sergeant for roughly 3 decades at the time of the incident. After taking his wife's life, Hilario fled south, but he was ultimately apprehended at a motel near the Texas-Mexico border that was located roughly 250 miles from his home in Keeland. Maddened by jealousy, he resorted to murdering his own wife, with whom he shared 2 children, because he thought she was flirting with another man during a gathering with friends. The Houston Police Department relieved Hilario of his duties, and he was ultimately sentenced to 40 years in prison after pleading guilty to first-degree murder. Number 6. Dwight Braithwaite. On December the 6th of 2013, a 21-year-old Brooklyn resident fatally stabbed a man following an argument inside of a fried chicken restaurant. The dispute was reportedly initiated by Kadeem Wilkinson, who'd taken issue with what he perceived to be flirtatious interactions between his girlfriend and a stranger at the Flatbush restaurant, who was identified as Dwight Braithwaite, aged 26. After Wilkinson confronted Braithwaite over the alleged flirting, the conflict turned into a physical altercation and spilled onto the sidewalk outside of the establishment. As was captured by video surveillance and subsequently used as evidence against him in court, Wilkinson ran to his nearby apartment building, where he grabbed a knife from his home. He then returned to the street and plunged the blade into Braithwaite's back, inflicting lethal injuries. Wilkinson's girlfriend testified against him during the case's legal proceedings, recounting to the jury how he'd admitted to her that he'd stabbed the victim in a jealous rage. Wilkinson was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and faced a maximum sentence of 25 years in prison. Number 5. Svan AA. In December of 2020, a man from the Hugley province of Turkey fatally stabbed his own wife after exchanging flirtatious messages with her while posing as a potential love interest online. The suspect was identified as Tanju Achar, aged 32, who'd reportedly carried out the murder after his 25-year-old wife, Svan Achar, demanded a divorce due to the man's abusive behavior towards her. While concocting a plan to eliminate his partner, Tanju reportedly learned of a local law which stipulated that infidelity could serve as a mitigating circumstance for murder. This aspect of Turkish legislation meant it was possible that Tanju might receive a reduced sentence for killing his wife if he could prove that she'd been unfaithful to him. He subsequently set out to deceive Svan into thinking she was being courted by various suitors on the internet. Tanju and his friends created fake online profiles and began sending flirtatious messages to Svan to conjure the illusion that she was cheating on him. The husband's devious plot culminated on December the 8th of 2020 when he stabbed Svan in the back with a knife. The authorities reported that the blade pierced the woman's heart and she passed away instantly. Although Tanju had sought to lessen the severity of his punishment by using Svan's purported infidelity as an excuse for his actions, the Fethiye Public Prosecutor's Office demanded the man receive an aggravated life sentence for deliberate murder of a spouse. Under Turkish law, prisoners serving such sentences are only eligible for parole after spending at least 36 years behind bars. Number 4. Isaiah Roberts. On May the 25th of 2012, a jealous man fatally shot a teenage immigrant whom he felt had flirted with his wife on a New York City public transport bus. After the suspected flirtation had already taken place, Lawrence Jones of Brooklyn lured 18-year-old Isaiah Roberts to a remote location near Howard Avenue in Bed-Stuy. It was there that Jones confronted the teen over his alleged inappropriate interactions with his wife. A heated argument erupted between Jones and Roberts, during the course of which the former pulled out a handgun. As the teenager attempted to flee, Jones fired a total of 5 rounds in his direction, with one bullet striking him in the back. Roberts was found by the police lying face down in the street, and he was ultimately pronounced dead after being transported to Kings County Hospital. Jones was taken into custody and charged with the young man's murder, for which he was eventually sentenced to 20 years to life behind bars. The victim, a native of Trinidad, reportedly held aspirations of one day becoming a professional architect. Number 3. Sakira L. A 22-year-old woman was left to bleed out in the middle of a North London street after being stabbed by a jealous acquaintance on September the 8th of 2019. Sakira L. had been targeted by Siobhan Collins Grant, aged 26. The pair had reportedly been friends for a time, but they were said to have experienced a falling out in August of 2019 after Collins Grant accused L. of flirting with her girlfriend, Savannah Simpson, while the women were spending a night out at a club. After engaging in a physical altercation, the two women were thrown out by the nightclub's bouncers. Tensions between L. and Collins Grant subsequently died down until the two crossed paths again a few weeks later. On the day of the deadly incident, Collins Grant was standing with 4 other females outside of a friend's residence in Chalk Farm, where she'd previously been residing. She'd been kicked out the day before and was there to pick up her clothes. Whilst the group was standing in the street, L. and 2 of her friends arrived at the scene. According to court records, Collins Grant charged the victim without warning, delivered a blow to her head, and stabbed her through the breast with a kitchen knife. She then ran to Camden and tossed the murder weapon into Regent's Canal. Emergency medical services were called to tend to L.'s critical stab wounds. A doctor attempted to perform open-heart surgery on the woman as she lay in the middle of the street, but she was pronounced dead just before midnight. Collins Grant pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Number 2. Fatima Muhammad. A Chicago man carried out the murder of his girlfriend's teenage cousin in West Fargo, North Dakota, on June the 6th of 2016. The fatal incident was precipitated by a dispute between 26-year-old David White Jr. and Fatima Muhammad, aged 19. The two were being driven home by Muhammad's cousin, who was in a romantic relationship with White at the time. During the course of the ride, Muhammad allegedly told her cousin that White had been flirting with her. The man was enraged by the accusation, to which he reacted by brandishing a gun and firing a fatal round into Muhammad's head. White threatened to shoot his girlfriend as well if she attempted to run away. He forced her to drive more than 600 miles east to his sister's house in Chicago. After pulling into the garage, White retrieved plastic bags, a laundry bag, and a pair of gloves from inside the residence. He placed the plastic bag over Muhammad's head and put the rest of her body in the laundry bag. The man then set down plastic bags on the floor of one of his sister's closets and situated the dead body on top of them. A few days later, White and his girlfriend dumped the body behind a vacant house near 60th Street and Aberdeen Avenue. White's girlfriend managed to escape his control and flee to her sister's home in Duluth, Minnesota. She went to local authorities to report her cousin's murder, and a short time later, Chicago police were notified of the situation. Muhammad's body was recovered and White was sentenced to 20 years in prison after pleading guilty to attempted murder in North Dakota. He was later extradited to Chicago to face a murder charge. Number 1. Joseph Trevizo. In May of 2018, an individual with mental disabilities was murdered by his own caretaker, who suspected the man of flirting with his girlfriend. Joseph Trevizo, aged 34, was being looked after by 42-year-old Jesse Dackins and his romantic partner, Tiffany Warren. The three reportedly lived together in an apartment in Mesa, Arizona. Court records indicate that the dispute between Trevizo and Dackins had arisen after the former was accused of flirting with Warren. Dackins grew jealous of Trevizo and allegedly attacked him with a knife, fatally stabbing him a total of 27 times in the living room of their home. He subsequently wrapped the victim in a butterfly print shower curtain and placed his body in Warren's car. The couple cleaned up Trevizo's blood and other traces of the attack from the scene of the crime before setting out for Star Valley, where they ultimately disposed of the dead body in the woods. The two then planned to flee to Wisconsin. During the drive there, however, Warren's vehicle broke down and the couple stole a van that belonged to Dackins' former employer. They were arrested by Winslow police on their way out of state on suspicion of vehicle theft. While in police custody, Dackins confessed to carrying out Trevizo's murder and subsequently led officers to the location of the body. Dackins and Warren were charged with first-degree murder, abuse of a child or vulnerable adult, theft of means of transportation, and tampering with evidence. Number 4. Bill Hall. In September of 2016, Texas woman Frances Hall, aged 53, was jailed for 2 years over the death of her husband, Bill. In the final 3 years of their relationship, Bill, a millionaire trucking magnate, had been having an affair with Bonnie Contreras, a former exotic dancer who was nearly 20 years younger than Frances. At some point, Contreras began taunting the latter with a plethora of messages, repeatedly insulting her and even sending clips of her and Bill being intimate. Frances eventually began to feel threatened as some of the messages reportedly included photos taken outside of her and Bill's home. On October the 10th of 2013, on a stretch of Texas Highway 1604 in San Antonio, Frances saw Contreras behind the wheel of her and Bill's family Range Rover. Following behind Contreras was Bill on his custom-made Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Frances made a U-turn in her Cadillac Escalade and began chasing after the mistress. She began ramming the Range Rover, but in the process accidentally hit 50-year-old Bill and knocked him off his motorcycle. The man sustained critical injuries from which he eventually passed away. Frances was arrested and subsequently found guilty of murder and aggravated assault, with the latter charge stemming from her hitting the car driven by Contreras. She faced a sentence of life in prison, but a jury determined that it had been a crime of sudden passion, and Frances was only sentenced to 2 years in jail on each count. Number 3. David Harris. Less than 10 years after they got married in 1992, David Harris was murdered by his wife, Clara Suarez Harris, following a confrontation sparked by his infidelity. The couple, from Friendswood, Texas, owned and operated a successful chain of dental practices. They had twin sons, and Clara became a stepmother to Lindsay, David's daughter from a previous marriage. Clara eventually came to suspect that David was being unfaithful. She hired a private detective agency to track his movements, and on July the 24th of 2002, investigators informed Clara that her husband and his mistress, his former receptionist Gail Bridges, were at the Hilton Hotel in Nassau Bay. Clara drove to the hotel and physically assaulted Bridges in the lobby before she was escorted by staff back to her Mercedes-Benz. As David and his mistress emerged from the hotel, Clara ran him over in the hotel's parking lot. Lindsay, then in her teens, was still a passenger in the Mercedes and pleaded with Clara to stop as she mowed her father down. Clara was charged with murder after David succumbed to his injuries at the scene. During her trial, one of the major focus points was whether she'd intended to harm her husband or had acted under momentary impulse in a crime of passion. Towards that end, both the prosecution and defense struggled to establish whether she'd struck David once or multiple times. Lindsay testified against Clara, and she, like other witnesses at the scene, claimed that the man had been run over 3 times, but a medical examiner could only confirm 1 tire mark on his body. A video of the scene, which was actually captured by the detective agency Clara had hired, was particularly damning, since it showed her circling the lot 3 times, but David's body wasn't clearly visible in the footage. An expert consultant for the defense argued that the turning radius of the Mercedes would have prevented her from turning sharply and running her husband over a second time. Counteracting the argument, the prosecution brought in an officer who'd been present at the scene and who pointed out a second tire mark in a police photo, the angle of which corresponded to where David's body had been. Once both sides had been heard, Clara was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. She was released on parole in May of 2018. Number 2. Mary Barrett. On January the 9th of 2021, Daniel Barrett murdered his wife, 43-year-old Mary, at their home in Plymouth, Pennsylvania. The man had accused his wife, a U.S. Air Force veteran, of cheating on him and was overcome with jealous rage after she'd allegedly admitted to spending time with another man. As per his subsequent police interviews, Daniel punched her in the face in front of the fireplace and then blacked out. As he regained his faculties, he remembered standing above Mary's body while wielding a pair of fire tongs. He proceeded to beat her with the tongs before grabbing a fire poker and then using it to strike her in the head repeatedly until the tool became entangled in her hair. He then took a knife and stabbed Mary in the lower back multiple times. Daniel went to the kitchen to splash water on his face, at which point he heard his dying wife making noises and gasping for air. As Mary was taking her final breaths, he dragged her to the basement, where he abandoned her until January the 10th, when he went down to cover her body with a sheet. By his own admission, Daniel contemplated taking his own life, but eventually decided to turn himself in to the authorities. He pleaded guilty to Mary's murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 1. Mona Haydari. In February of 2022, horrific footage emerged from Iran of a man walking the streets while carrying a machete in one hand and his wife's severed head in the other. The victim was identified as Mona Haydari, while her husband was named as Sajjad. According to media reports on the matter, Mona had fled to Turkey with another man with whom she had allegedly been having an affair. She was tracked to the country by her father, only identified as Javad, who subsequently brought her back to Iran in early February. Sajjad, who was seen grinning with satisfaction in the footage, attacked, killed and decapitated his wife in the southwestern city of Avaz with the help of his brother. The latter disposed of Mona's body, while in a gruesome display, Sajjad paraded her head on the local streets. Both men were consequently arrested, and their legal punishment remained to be determined as of the latest updates on the case. Mona's father seemingly condoned Sajjad's actions, claiming that he'd been a good husband to her and gave her the best life. He described the instances of domestic violence which he admitted had occurred between them as completely normal occurrences between a husband and wife. The chief of the State Security Force, or SSF, claimed that family differences had been the reason for the killing, which some women's rights activists postulated was the official protocol when it came to honor killings. The state-run news site Rokna was reportedly shut down for publishing the story and video at the time of the incident. There was an outpouring of shock and outrage over the killing across Iranian newspapers and social media outlets. It reignited debates over the prevalence of honor killings in the country, which, according to the Sharq daily newspaper, number up to 450 annually. Number 8. Catherine Bush. On March the 21st of 2022, during a Jet 2 flight from Manchester, England to Antalya, Turkey, British woman Catherine Bush became belligerent and confrontational with the cabin crew, as well as other passengers. Her outburst, which was captured in a cell phone video that subsequently went viral, was reportedly triggered about an hour and a half into the flight. She'd grown increasingly disturbed by the sound of young children crying on board the plane, and also claimed that certain passengers had been looking at her funny. In order to confront the individuals responsible for the perceived disrespect, Bush walked to the front of the cabin and allegedly slapped some of her fellow travelers. Flight staff intervened, requesting that she calm down and return to her seat. It was at that point that Bush shifted her ire towards the crew, launching a barrage of expletive-laden insults at them. According to eyewitnesses, the woman then tried to exit the aircraft mid-flight by opening one of its doors, but was fortunately unable to do so. The flight was ultimately diverted to the Austrian capital of Vienna, where Bush was removed from the plane. In the incident's aftermath, Jet2 announced that they were issuing the woman a hefty fine, as well as a lifetime ban from any of the airline's future flights. Number 7. Qutbi Abdelkader. Shortly before 5 p.m. on May the 5th of 2021, a gun was fired during an altercation outside of the Smoke Some Smoke shop in New Orleans, Louisiana. Responding police officers came upon a man identified as Anthony Francois, who sustained a gunshot wound. Francois was taken to a nearby hospital where he ultimately passed away. Another man, later named as 24-year-old Qutbi Abdelkader, was detained by police at the store for questioning. It was quickly established that Abdelkader had been responsible for the shooting, and he was consequently arrested on a charge of second-degree murder. In the wake of the incident, it emerged that Francois had allegedly been threatening and harassing the Smoke Some staff almost daily for over a week. On the day of the shooting, Abdelkader had confronted the man about his behavior after seeing him banging on the glass storefront. During his interviews with investigators, Abdelkader claimed to have seen Francois reaching for an object as their argument escalated. Believing the man to have been in the process of pulling out a gun, Abdelkader brandished his own weapon and shot him twice. Despite his initial claims of self-defense, he was ultimately indicted on the murder charge in February of 2022. Number 6. Lamont Butler. Las Vegas police were dispatched to a residence at about 1:50 p.m. on January the 17th of 2022 after receiving reports of gunfire on the premises. Upon their arrival, officers discovered that a man later named by the Clark County Coroner's Office as DeMaurian Turner had been shot. The incident was related to an altercation that had erupted during a social gathering being held in the 900 block of Morgan Avenue. Turner was ultimately declared dead at the scene. The individual who'd fired the fatal round reportedly fled following the shooting, but he was ultimately identified as 29-year-old Lamont Butler. 3 days later, Butler was tracked down by the Metro Police and booked into the Clark County Detention Center on a single count of open murder. Number 5. Krista Glover. While participating in the Players' Championship in May of 2018, professional golfer Lucas Glover was involved in a domestic violence incident in Florida. On the 12th of the month, the 38-year-old had contacted the St. Johns County Sheriff's Department following an altercation with his wife, Krista, in which she'd allegedly attacked both him and his mother. Glover told investigators that his wife would often get upset with him, sometimes to the point of turning physically violent, whenever he played poorly in a golf tournament. During the incident in question, Krista had drunkenly initiated an argument with Glover about how he'd failed to reach the championship round that weekend. She proceeded to berate and hit him in front of their family. When his mother attempted to intervene, Krista reportedly struck her in the arms and chest. She reportedly became hostile towards the responding police officers as well, launching a barrage of profanities as they took her into custody. Krista was ultimately charged with domestic battery and resisting arrest, and the following day was released from the county jail on a $2,500 bond. It later emerged that at the behest of Glover himself, the charges against his wife had been dropped and she thus avoided punishment in connection to the incident. Number 4. Charlene Thompson. Two women got into a heated argument that turned violent at a home in Mount Airy, Ohio, a suburban neighborhood of northern Cincinnati, on December the 2nd of 2018. Subsequent reports didn't specify the relationship between the individuals, one of whom was identified as 61-year-old Charlene Thompson and described as the primary aggressor in the altercation. As indicated by court records, the situation dramatically escalated and culminated with Thompson dumping hot grease all over the other woman. The victim reportedly suffered severe burns to her arms and back, which were clearly visible to officers when they arrived at the scene. Thompson was taken into police custody and charged with felonious assault, and her bond was subsequently set at $50,000. At the time of her arrest, Thompson already had 2 outstanding warrants in Hamilton County, stemming from charges of criminal damaging or endangering. It also emerged that she had a long history of criminal activity, including several instances of assault. During one incident, which occurred on Christmas Eve 2006, Thompson had allegedly struck her daughter over the head, although the charges were eventually dismissed as part of a plea deal. Beyond her assault-related arrests, the woman had also faced criminal charges in connection to drug possession, arson, and theft in the past. Number 3. Ayanna Mayweather. In the early morning hours of April the 4th of 2020, Ayanna Mayweather was arrested following a violent altercation at the residence of rapper NBA Youngboy in Houston, Texas. The 19-year-old woman, identified as the daughter of former boxer Floyd Mayweather, had reportedly gotten into an argument with her love rival, LaPatra Lashai Jacobs, the previous night. It later emerged that Jacobs was the mother of one of NBA Youngboy's children, while Mayweather claimed to be engaged to the prolific hip-hop artist. Investigators learned that it was Jacobs who'd initiated the altercation by pulling Mayweather's hair, after which the latter allegedly charged at her with 2 knives and proceeded to stab her multiple times in the arm. Although her injuries were described as non-life-threatening, Jacobs was subsequently taken to a nearby hospital to undergo surgery. Upon her arrest, Mayweather was booked into the Harris County Jail on a charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and her bond was set at $30,000. For the attack, the young woman faced a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison, but she ultimately reached a plea deal with prosecutors in April of 2022, which sentenced her to 6 years of probation and 40 hours of community service. Number 2. Brian Alexis Cifuentes. On January the 30th of 2022, the Los Angeles Rams played against the San Francisco 49ers in the National Football League's NFC Championship game at SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, California. Roughly 30 minutes after the game had begun, stadium security found a man later identified as Daniel Luna unconscious in the parking lot. Emergency services were called to the scene and Luna was transported to Harbor UCLA Medical Center, where he was placed in a medically induced coma. Investigators obtained surveillance footage from the stadium in an attempt to determine what events had led to Luna's catatonic state. As detailed by the Inglewood mayor in a subsequent press conference, security video had captured a fight between Luna and another man, Brian Alexis Cifuentes, during what appeared to have been a tailgate party. Luna, who was reported to have been wearing a 49ers jersey, had instigated the altercation by pushing the Rams jersey-clad Cifuentes. The latter then retaliated by pushing Luna back and punching him in the mouth, knocking him unconscious. The police traced the vehicle shown in the video that was believed to have belonged to Cifuentes and contacted its registered owner. The man ultimately agreed to speak with investigators about the incident, voluntarily going to the Inglewood Police Department later that night to undergo a line of questioning. Following the interview, 33-year-old Cifuentes was arrested and charged with 1 felony count of battery with serious bodily injury. Updates indicated that he was scheduled to be arraigned on August the 29th of 2022. Number 1. Brittany Alicia Griffith. Georgia woman Brittany Alicia Griffith was arrested for shooting a teenager in the head during a road rage altercation on May the 1st of 2022. Shortly before 5 p.m., the 30-year-old woman had been following Ashlyn Crouch's car along Interstate 20 near Villa Rica for an estimated 15 miles. According to local police, their dispute had been sparked by a previous traffic incident in which Crouch had cut Griffith off. The altercation abruptly escalated as the two vehicles approached the Chapel Hill Road exit in Douglasville, which was when Griffith allegedly pulled out a gun and fired a single round in the teen's direction. The bullet reportedly struck the victim behind the ear before exiting through the side of her eye. Crouch was rushed to a hospital for treatment, and medical staff subsequently revealed that she was expected to make a full recovery. A female passenger in Crouch's car took a picture of the moment Griffith had brandished a firearm, which investigators used to identify the suspect. Immediately after the shooting, in what was regarded as a casual attitude towards her actions, Griffith had reportedly gone to get her nails done. She eventually turned herself into the authorities at about 11 p.m. that night and was consequently charged with aggravated assault and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, as well as 3 counts of cruelty to children. The latter charge stemmed from the fact that Griffith's 3 children had been in the car with her at the time she'd fired the gun. The following morning, Judge Susan Camp denied Griffith's bond during a hearing at the Douglas County Magistrate Court. Number 7. Shelley Vaughn. In 2022, Florida man Eric Addison got into an argument with his ex-girlfriend Shelley Vaughn at his apartment in Clearwater Beach, As the man would later report, 46-year-old Vaughn had been drinking and consuming illicit substances leading up to their row. The heated interaction escalated after, in a fit of rage, the woman had launched Addison's keys and cell phone over the railing of his balcony. Vaughn then grabbed the man's pug, Bucky, and threw him from the balcony as well. The incident was witnessed by several residents, and the pet dropped 7 stories to the parking lot below, sustaining fatal injuries. The police were called, and Addison subsequently told officers that he was devastated and that the entire incident was like a blur in his mind. He claimed that Vaughn had been violent in the past, but noted that he'd never imagined she'd go so far. The woman was jailed on charges of aggravated animal cruelty, criminal mischief, and domestic battery. Addison also filed a civil lawsuit against his ex, and because she lived 2 floors below him, obtained a restraining order that prevented Vaughn from making contact with him. Number 6. Benno Nume. 30-year-old Italian bodybuilder Benno Nume was arrested by local authorities in the province of South Tyrol in late January of 2021 in connection to the murder of his parents. Teacher Peter Nume and his wife Laura had been reported missing, and the ensuing investigation led the authorities to their son. He confessed to the double homicide after his arrest and revealed that his murderous rage had been triggered by an argument with his father. While at their home in Bolzano, the latter had asked that Benno get out of bed and take the family dog out for a walk. When he refused, Peter began scolding him and complaining that he wasn't doing his share of household chores, reportedly calling him a failure. The bodybuilder subsequently reported, "I just wanted silence, so I shut him up." He attacked Peter in the hallway and strangled him to death with a climbing rope. When his mother returned home a short while later, Benno killed her in the same manner. The man confessed to have ended her life without even saying goodbye, before throwing her and Paul's body from a bridge into the Adige River. Laura's remains were discovered in the water and exhibited signs of strangulation, but Peter's body never surfaced, with only traces of his blood being found on the bridge. Number 5. Nicolette Mazziotti and James McKnight. 2 people were arrested in early August of 2019 following a road rage altercation in Greece, New York. 28-year-old Nicolette Mazziotti had been involved in a dispute with another motorist in the area of Denise Road and Hampton Boulevard. As their interaction became more heated, the woman returned to her car, retrieved a knife, and stabbed the other driver's car in the front tire before fleeing the scene. The police were called to the scene, and the unnamed victim initially declined to press charges. Officers returned to the site of the altercation within 10 minutes, responding to reports of a second and more serious attack. 33-year-old James McKnight, whose relationship with Mazziotti wasn't made immediately clear, struck the victim with an aluminium bat, inflicting injuries to the back, arm, and torso. McKnight, too, fled, but was ultimately arrested alongside Mazziotti. The former was charged with assault, second-degree petite larceny, as he'd stolen the bat used in the attack, and was denied bail due to a pre-existing felony conviction. Mazziotti was charged with second-degree harassment for the physical contact she'd had with the victim, as well as with criminal mischief for stabbing the tire. Number 4. Daria Brown. On June the 3rd of 2022, Iowa City police officers were called to a downtown bar following reports that a woman was causing damage to the establishment. 22-year-old Daria Brown had begun hitting the windows after she'd been denied entry due to her elevated level of intoxication. Law enforcement learned that Brown had also assaulted a bar employee, but no charges were pursued in that direction. Nevertheless, officers decided to take her into custody because she was intoxicated and exhibited assaultive behavior. She had a history of being combative towards the police, and efforts to verbally pacify her proved unsuccessful. Brown resisted arrest, assaulting 3 officers in the process. One of them attempted to use chemical spray on her, but the device failed to deploy, as shown by subsequently released body cam footage. Brown then tried to disarm an officer of his taser while she was being placed in the back of a patrol car. She was hit multiple times in the back until she let go of the weapon, but reportedly didn't require treatment at the time of her booking. Brown's charges included public intoxication, disarming a peace officer, and interference with official acts causing bodily injury. Number 3. Killy Nicole Cunningham. A young woman from Monroe County, Pennsylvania, became overwhelmed with rage in February of 2019 after she'd reportedly lost money to a pinball machine at the Blue Valley Lanes bowling alley. 26-year-old Killy Nicole Cunningham punched the machine's glass panel, and in an effort to calm her down, employees reimbursed her money. They then asked Cunningham to leave, but she refused, instead demanding more alcohol. When her order was denied, she threw a cup of water in a worker's face and stormed out of the establishment. Officers from the Slate Belt Regional Police Department were called to the scene and caught up to Cunningham while she was walking with a friend. They asked the woman to identify herself, but she became belligerent and started yelling profanities at them. Officers decided to take her into custody after determining that she was inebriated to the extent that she presented a danger to herself and others. As they were struggling to get her into the patrol car, Cunningham repeatedly unbuckled her seatbelt and attempted to flee, while also persisting in her aggressive behavior. She cursed and spat at officers, kicking one of them in the chest before headbutting him. Cunningham kicked a second officer as they were escorting her into the police station. Law enforcement then determined that she needed medical attention due to her high level of inebriation. The woman kept on spitting on responding EMTs, and a spit hood was put on her as she was being transferred to the ambulance. Once inside, however, she forcefully bit into a paramedic's forearm, leaving a mark. Cunningham kept brawling with officers and medical staff before she was ultimately chemically sedated. In the aftermath of her violent outburst, she was charged with 3 counts of aggravated assault, 3 counts of simple assault, 1 count of resisting arrest, and 3 related offenses. Number 2. Amanda Stanton. In September of 2018, reality star Amanda Stanton was at a co-ed bachelorette party at the Wynn Encore in Las Vegas alongside her boyfriend Bobby Jacobs. At around 3 a.m., security guards were sent to the room following a noise complaint, and Jacobs began talking to them. 26-year-old Stanton, known for her appearances on The Bachelor and Bachelor in Paradise, aggressively intervened. In what was deemed a dramatic overreaction, she forcefully pushed her boyfriend. Even though Jacobs was taller than her by 1 foot and 3 inches, the shove coupled with Stanton's drunken demeanor was considered serious enough for the guards to call the police. The mother of 2 was arrested for misdemeanor domestic battery and later released. As reported by TMZ, the California native and Jacobs were still together in the incident's aftermath and suspected that the former's behavior had been influenced by someone spiking her drink during the party. Number 1. Michael Close. Close to noon on June the 10th of 2020, a man opened fire on a couple with an AK-47 rifle, following a dispute over dog drop-ins on the 3000 block of Fox Street in Denver, Colorado. The shooting occurred in a rock garden outside Michael Close's apartment complex, where he was reported to have confronted Isabella Thallas and Darian Simon, both in their 20s, as they were walking their dog. He had become enraged that the pet had defecated close to his window and asked Simon if he was going to train the dog or just yell at it. Surveillance camera footage later presented by prosecutors showed Close then opening his blinds, pointing the rifle at the couple, and releasing at least 24 rounds. Thallas, who turned 21 2 days earlier, was killed instantly, while Simon survived after being shot twice in the legs. The police were alerted by Close's girlfriend, whom he'd called crying, to confess the shooting before driving towards the mountains in his black Mercedes SUV. Close was arrested without incident by Jefferson County Sheriff deputies after the police had tracked his cell phone. An investigation revealed that the rifle he'd used had been taken from the personal collection of his lifelong friend, Sergeant Dan Politica of the Denver Police. Reportedly without his knowledge or permission, Close had called him minutes after the shooting to say he'd done something really bad and there's no going back from this now. Politica resigned in the shooting's aftermath, even though he wasn't being actively investigated for misconduct. Close faced 22 separate criminal counts stemming from the shooting, including first-degree murder, to which, according to the latest updates, he'd pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Number 8. Chris Gobbin. Canadian man Jacques Gobbin returned to his Orleans home on April the 22nd of 2014 to find that his wife had been brutally attacked. The woman, 49-year-old Luce Lavertu, had suffered multiple injuries, including a deep slash to her throat, to which she ultimately succumbed. Shortly after the incident, the woman's son, 18-year-old Chris Gobbin, was arrested in the neighborhood and charged with first-degree murder. According to his family, who'd sought help from the healthcare system the previous year, investigators would learn that Gobin and Lavurtu had been arguing about him being late for school when the teenager savagely attacked her. In a chilling confession hours after the killing, he told the detective, "I overreacted," while referencing a physical altercation with his mother. She had reportedly grabbed him by the neck and tried kicking him out. Gobin overpowered Lavurtu and choked her to the point of unconsciousness before grabbing a steak knife from the kitchen to finish her off. He stabbed the woman multiple times and slit her throat. The teen covered her head with a garbage bag, bound her hands with a red ribbon, and dragged her into the living room. As his mother lay dying, he left the house and called a neighbor to buy illicit substances, which he smoked next door. He then returned to the home and hid inside until his father came back from work and made the gruesome discovery. Gobin actually heard him make the 911 call as he lay in wait with an axe in the bathroom. When the man reported that he thought his son was in the house and possibly responsible for the killing, Gobin dropped the axe and fled the home while still wearing his pajamas. He was taken into custody and in 2015 pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, for which he was given a life sentence with no parole available for 12 years. Number 7. Amy Nicole Perino. Missouri woman Amy Nicole Perino was arrested in December of 2018 for abuse and assault against her live-in boyfriend. The 43-year-old attacked the unnamed man at the Boone County home they shared after he'd reportedly refused to perform an intimate act on her. Perino punched him roughly 24 times with a closed fist, in addition to striking him with a belt, a cell phone, and a brass plate. The woman chased him around the home in the nude before throwing him on the floor. Perino then straddled her boyfriend, ordering him to perform the act on her, which reportedly caused him to fear for his life as he couldn't breathe properly. The man eventually called the authorities, and responding officers found him with red marks on his chest as well as cuts to his nose and arms. He told them that he no longer felt safe living with Perino, as she would get very violent very quickly. After the woman was taken into custody, she was held on a $25,000 cash bail. A fifth of the money was for damages, which she'd caused inside the jail, which, according to her charging documents, included smashing a phone and smearing feces on the walls. Number 6. Deshawn Longmire. 23-year-old Deshawn Longmire surrendered to the authorities in Houston, Texas, following the fatal shooting of a man on South Interstate Highway 45. The incident occurred on June the 24th, 2022, and had begun as a road rage dispute. 58-year-old Ronald Mouton, the senior pastor of East Bethel Missionary Baptist Church, was found by Houston Fire Department paramedics in a crashed white BMW. He was pronounced dead after having suffered a gunshot wound. Longmire, an Uber driver, initially told investigators that he wasn't in the area at the time and wasn't immediately arrested. However, witness testimony and Uber records placed his black Honda at the scene. Bystanders reported that the two men, whom it was later determined were strangers to each other, had argued in traffic. They then saw Longmire stretch his arm out the window with a pistol in hand. He opened fire, fatally struck the pastor, and then drove away from the scene. Mouton was survived by a wife, 4 children, and 10 grandchildren. The police identified Longmire as the main suspect in the shooting and released surveillance footage of his vehicle, along with a $15,000 reward for information leading to his capture. After he turned himself in, Longmire was held on a $500,000 bond. Number 5. Mike Purchase. In March of 2022, after his father's recent and sudden death, 19-year-old Jack Stokes had taken over mortgage payments for the family home in Hunter Valley, Australia. As reported by those familiar with his situation, he was struggling to build a life for himself in the midst of the family tragedy. Adding to the teen's stress were confrontations with his neighbor, 48-year-old Mike Purchase. The latter had been initially bothered by the teenager's decision to move sandbags in order to prevent floodwaters from reaching another neighbor's home. Purchase also complained about Stokes' floodlight, which he claimed were beaming into his house. The teen reportedly stopped using the light for weeks and only turned it on when he heard his dogs barking one night in March. He got out of the home to find that the animals had been disturbed by Purchase, who was trying to get onto his yard. Footage captured by Stokes' female housemate would show the older man fall on his face while climbing the teenager's fence. Stokes had repeatedly warned him not to come onto his property and told him he'd call the police. Purchase maintained that he'd only scaled the fence to knock on his front door, and the two men then walked towards the home's entrance. Purchase then started approaching Stokes' housemate as she was filming, and the teen warned him not to touch her. He got in between them and Purchase menacingly grinned into his face before pushing him. Stokes then blitzed the man with a two-punch combination that knocked him out cold. He told his housemate to call the police and got his first aid kit to tend to Purchase's wounds until an ambulance arrived. The man recovered, while Stokes later claimed that he didn't regret punching him as he'd warned him to get off his property. The clip of the confrontation went viral, particularly due to the size disparity between the two men. Many comments were in support of the teenager, indicating that Purchase had overreacted by trespassing and then getting in his face. The man himself later reportedly wanted to apologize to Stokes for his behavior. Number 4. Carmen Lee. In June of 2021, Georgia police sought the public's help in identifying the individual or people responsible for the death of 25-year-old Carmen Kai-Yi Lee. She had been driving southbound on Peachtree Industrial Boulevard in Doraville after having dinner with her parents on May the 29th. In a dashcam video subsequently released by investigators, several cars were shown passing her Toyota RAV4 between 9 and 9:30 p.m. Someone fired 2 shots at the vehicle. A bullet struck Lee in the head and she died at the scene. While the police reported it as a road rage incident, it wasn't clear if Lee had been the intended target or caught in the crossfire of another dispute. Law enforcement described the investigation as extremely frustrating because they had virtually no evidence with which to work. As of August of 2021, photos of Lee, her car, and details about the deadly shooting were featured on an electronic billboard placed where the incident had happened. The police hoped that it would trigger some memories for other motorists who'd passed through the area. A $10,000 reward was also offered in the case. Number 3. Nicola Layton and Tyrese Ulysses. A mother and son were convicted in December of 2021, along with 2 others, for the killing of a disabled teenager in Sydenham, South London. On April the 10th, Levi Ernest Morrison and a few of his friends had repeatedly knocked on the door of 36-year-old Nicola Layton, asking about her son, Tyrese Ulysses. The group was looking for him in connection to a taunting video he'd made earlier, and both sides were reported to have had gang affiliations. Layton was enraged by their persistence and called the police, threatening to batter the youths if they came back. She also contacted 19-year-old Ulysses, who became furious that Ernest Morrison had been bothering her. He rallied a few of his friends, including fellow teenager Alex Sproul's, and they armed themselves with bladed weapons. Layton herself drove the teens in her red Suzuki 4x4 Jeep as they went looking for their rivals. The group caught up with Ernest Morrison, who suffered from autism and nerve damage to his leg that left him needing a crutch to walk around. The group ambushed the teen. He was taken down and stabbed, with the most severe of the injuries being inflicted by Sproul's, who stabbed him in the groin with a machete. The fatal attack lasted roughly 30 seconds, after which Layton drove the teens away from the crime scene. She and Sproul's were found guilty of murder and jailed for at least 23 and 20 years respectively, while Ulysses received 13 years for manslaughter. Number 2. Nathaniel Nugent. British man Solomon Gordon suffered life-threatening injuries on July the 24th of 2021 after being stabbed multiple times by Nathaniel Nugent, The latter, a drill rapper from the town of Redditch, had had a troublesome relationship with his ex-girlfriend, who was also the mother of his child, even though the woman had a restraining order against him they'd met at a pub earlier in the day. The pair, along with their son, left the establishment in the same taxi, but an argument soon broke out in the vehicle. The woman, whose identity wasn't disclosed, stopped the taxi father from her home because she didn't want 25-year-old Nugent to know where she lived. The rapper then followed her, a decision he'd later claim was made out of concern because his former partner had walked off in the night while kind of drunk and with their child in tow. CCTV captured him walking behind her at a distance. Nugent would later tell investigators that after getting lost in the area of Suffolk Road, Wednesbury, he overheard arguing and recognized his ex's voice. He burst into her home with a flick knife in hand and found Gordon, whom he claimed was wearing a face covering and appeared to be assaulting the woman. It was reported that the two were in a relationship, and surprised by the rapper's intrusion, Nugent stabbed Gordon 3 times in the chest as well as in the arm and back before fleeing. The victim lost a massive amount of blood and required life-saving surgery at a local hospital in the aftermath. Nugent was arrested and ultimately found guilty of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison, 18 of which would be in custody and 9 on license. Number 1. Lillian Isabel Reyes. On July the 13th of 2022, a road rage incident in southwest Miami-Dade County resulted in a violent altercation that subsequently required the intervention of local law enforcement. While the circumstances of the initial argument were unclear, the authorities discovered that it involved 28-year-old Miami resident Lillian Isabel Reyes and an unnamed woman. After their traffic dispute, the latter stopped at a gas station before Reyes pulled up and parked at the pump behind hers. She got out of her car and walked up to the driver's side of the woman's vehicle. Following a brief verbal exchange, and as the woman was in the process of rolling up her window, Reyes leaned in and punched her in the face. She fled the scene in the aftermath, but the victim was able to get her license plate number. Reyes was arrested at her homestead residence on a charge of burglary with assault or battery. Thanks for watching. For a year, would you rather live in an underground bunker or have to deal exclusively with enraged Karens at your workplace? Let us know in the comments section below.